The bread she stole was not for her. And what Sarah saw when she followed that barefoot child down the dusty red trail changed the course of 2 lives and buried once and for all the greatest secret of that plantation. It was an afternoon in July, when the Georgia sun hangs low and seems to scorch even the shadows. Sarah Montgomery Preston sat in her wicker chair by the window of the great house kitchen, her blue eyes sharp, watching every move of the house girls preparing dinner. The smell of stewed greens and salt pork rose thick through the humid air, mingled with the scent of hickory burning in the stone hearth and the cloying aroma of molasses boiling in copper vats outside. It was a day like any other at Oakwood Grove, until it wasn't. A small shadow darted through the back door as quick as a lizard in the heat. A Negro girl, no more than 8 years old, with short, frayed braids and bare feet coated in Georgia clay, reached a slender arm toward the table where the golden biscuits rested, still warm from the morning oven. Her fingers touched the soft crust. They closed over the bread with a silent, desperate firmness, and then she was gone, her heels barely touching the floor, vanishing through the same door she had entered. Sarah dropped her embroidery hoop. There was a sudden pull inside her. Not just indignation, but curiosity, the kind that knots the stomach and refuses to let go. That girl wasn't hungry. She was taking that bread to someone, and that was what Sarah needed to find out. Oakwood Grove rose upon a gentle hill a few miles from the town of Savannah, in the heart of the South, in the year 1856. The great house had whitewashed walls that reflected the cruel noon light and tall windows with dark green shutters. Below, the cotton fields stretched like a white sea as far as the eye could see, and in their midst, dozens of enslaved souls labored from before the sun rose until long after it set. The constant rhythm of the gin, the metallic groan of the water wheels, the low mournful spirituals they sang to bear the weight of the day. All of this formed the permanent soundtrack of a world where some were born free and many were born bound. Sarah Montgomery Preston was 33 years old and had lived on that plantation for 20 years, ever since she married Colonel Silas Preston, a man with heavy hands and a voice like thunder who managed his lands and his people with the absolute conviction of one who never doubted his right to rule. Colonel Silas was the kind of man who woke early, ordered a lashing before breakfast, and still slept with a clear conscience, for he had never learned that conscience and peaceful sleep rarely walk together for long. There were 116 slaves on the plantation. Sarah knew this number because the colonel repeated it with pride during brandy rounds with other gentlemen, like a man reciting the titles of a library he had never actually opened. But she had never stopped to consider what that number truly meant. 116 lives, 116 stories, 116 nights of dreams or nightmares that she had never bothered to wonder about. Sarah had learned early that the role of a Southern lady was ornamental. She embroidered, she prayed, she oversaw the kitchen, she received guests, she smiled at the right moments, and she kept her eyes down when Colonel Silas punished someone in the yard. She was not cruel by nature. She was simply blinded by convention, numbed by 20 years of a life that had never asked her to truly see. She had learned the order of things was just so, that she was born on the right side, that the discomfort of others was part of the landscape, like the drone of cicadas or the smell of burnt sugar, something you hear and smell and then cease to notice. But on that July afternoon, her eyes were wide open. She slipped through the side door of the great house, smoothing her heavy cotton skirts, and followed the girl at a safe distance. The heat smelled of baked earth and dry manure. The cicadas screamed without pause, a lament that never ended. Sarah stayed among the magnolias lining the path, her leather boots treading softly so as not to make a sound. The girl, she knew, was named Hattie. She was the daughter of Ruth, a woman who worked the laundry and whom Sarah had never looked at closely, for she had never had a reason. But now she did. What she did not know was that following that child down that red dirt path would lead her to a truth that no embroidery in the world could ever cover again. Hattie crossed the yard without looking back, passing the whipping post, that dark piece of timber stained by time and agony that stood in the center of the clearing as a permanent warning, and followed a narrow trail that opened between the tall cornstalks. Sarah furrowed her brow. The quarters were on the other side, near the stables, and Ruth would be there working. So where was this child going? The late afternoon sun hit from the side, and the red earth threw back the day's accumulated heat, a heat that rose through the soles of Sarah's boots and tried to melt her resolve before she even recognized it as such. The broad leaves of the corn swayed heavy in the hot wind blowing off the Savannah River, bringing the scent of silt and stagnant water, and the distant croak of bullfrogs unaware the day had not yet ended. Sarah pushed aside a branch with her hands and saw a tiny shack, nearly invisible, made of old planks and palmetto leaves tied with twine, leaning against a stone wall covered in dark moss. A thin grey wisp of smoke rose slowly through a gap in the makeshift roof. Sarah's heart gave a leap. In 20 years at Oakwood, she had never seen this place. Hattie stooped to enter through the low door, which was little more than a hole in the rotting wood. Sarah approached slowly, kneeling behind a cluster of scrub oaks, the dry twigs scratching her hands as she balanced on the hard ground. The smell of wild mint and mouldy dampness reached her nostrils. Inside, muffled voices. Hattie's voice, sharp and full of care, saying, "I brought it, Aunt Bessie." A warm biscuit from the big house kitchen, and another voice, weak as a candle flame in the wind, answering, "My sweet girl, bless you for coming." Bessie. The name pierced Sarah's memory like a thorn. Bessie had been a housemaid at the great house 8 years ago. A young woman, industrious, with bright eyes and nimble hands, that polished the silver without leaving a mark. And then, on a morning in October 1848, she had simply vanished. Slave catchers were hired, trails were searched, neighboring plantations consulted. Colonel Silas had ordered 2 men whipped on suspicion of helping her, but nothing was found. Bessie had been marked as a runaway and forgotten, with the speed that world forgets anything no longer useful. But Bessie had not run. She was right there, hidden in a filthy hole 300 yards from the house she had served, for 8 long years. Sarah crawled until she was near a wide gap between 2 boards. She peered through the crack. What she saw made the air vanish from her lungs. Lying on a pile of dry straw and grimy rags was a black woman of perhaps 26 years, so consumed by sickness and hunger that her skin seemed stretched directly over her bones. Her sunken eyes burned with the fever of someone already on the border between the living and the dead. A deep, racking cough shook her entire frame with every breath, as if something inside her were breaking piece by piece. Hattie was kneeling beside her, breaking the bread into tiny crumbs and placing them one by one on the woman's cracked lips, with the gentleness of someone tending a wounded bird fallen from the nest. "Slowly, Aunt Bessie. Chew it well," Hattie whispered. The woman swallowed with visible effort, tears carving paths down a thin face marked by old scars. "Hattie, child, you shouldn't risk it so. If the master finds you taking food, they'll hide you raw." The girl shook her head with a firmness startling for an 8-year-old. "I won't let you starve, Aunt Bessie. You're good to me. You tell me the pretty stories. I love you." Sarah did not breathe. She remained motionless behind the oaks, hands clenched on the branches, her thoughts spinning. So that was it. Bessie hadn't run. Someone had hidden her here, or she had chosen to hide herself, and this child of 8 kept her alive long enough for Sarah to wonder, how long, and why, and who else knew? This decision to follow Hattie would have consequences. Sarah would only realize hours later, when darkness fell over the grove, and she sat on the floor of her own room, head in her hands, unable to stop shaking. Bessie gripped Hattie's hand with a strength that surprised Sarah, bony fingers squeezing the child's small ones. "Hattie, listen to what I tell you, for I am dying, girl. This fever is eating me from within. I feel it." "Don't talk so, Aunt Bessie." "No, my daughter, my time has come. But before I leave this world of sorrow, you must know the truth I've kept for 8 years, the truth that only I, Ruth, and one other soul know." Hattie stopped crying, her large eyes fixed on Bessie's face with a mixture of fear and a seriousness far beyond her age. "What truth, Aunt Bessie?" Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine like cold water. She, too, needed to know. Every fiber of her body was taut as a wire about to snap. Bessie took a deep breath, and her voice came out weak but burdened with a pain held for an eternity. "Hattie, Ruth is not your mother by blood. She raised you because I asked her. Because I could not claim you. Because if anyone knew the truth, they would have killed you, child. I am your true mother." The silence that followed was so dense, Sarah could hear her own heart thumping in her ears. Hattie sat frozen, mouth agape, eyes wide. Bessie continued, tears flowing freely now down her fevered face, each word costing a strength she barely possessed. "You came from my womb, Hattie. Born 8 years ago, on a night of thunder, right here in this shack. Ruth helped me bring you, and since then she raised you as her own to keep you safe so no one would suspect." The woman paused to breathe, her chest heaving with effort. "Because your father is no common man, my child. Your father is Reverend Thomas Miller, the circuit rider of the Savannah Parish. The man who baptizes the babies, who marries the couples, who preaches the word of God every Sunday." Sarah clapped both hands over her mouth. "He forced me one night, when I went to deliver supplies from the farm to the parsonage. I was 17. He threatened to kill me if I spoke a word. When I found I was carrying you, I knew if the secret came out, he'd have me dead. So Ruth pretended to be with child too. She tied rags round her belly, fooled them all. When you were born, she took you in her arms and said you were hers, and I hid here, to die far from all eyes. But Ruth wouldn't let me die. She brought me food in secret for years, and when you grew a bit, she taught you the way here. And you, my dear child, have kept me breathing with your kindness." Bessie closed her eyes for a moment, as if the effort of each sentence cost a part of her that could not be replaced. Then she opened them again, and there was a strange clarity in them, the clarity of one who has nothing left to lose and can finally be entirely honest. "I regret much, my daughter. I regret not screaming that night. I regret living in fear for so long. But I never regretted bearing you. You are the only good this world gave me by accident." Bessie's voice failed. Hattie had begun to cry silently, tears falling onto Bessie's hands, which she held with both arms. "Mother, but why? Why did you hide? Why did you leave me?" "Because I loved you from the first day, my girl, and to protect you I had to disappear." Bessie squeezed Hattie's hand one last time. "Promise me. Promise you will live. That you will be free one day. That you will honor my name by being strong." Hattie nodded, unable to speak. Bessie smiled, a slow and exhausted smile, and closed her eyes. Her chest rose once, twice, and then stopped. Silence fell over the shack like a heavy shroud, broken only by the low, inconsolable sobbing of an 8-year-old girl who had found and lost her true mother in the same instant. Sarah backed away, stumbling, her legs like wool, her vision blurred by tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. She returned to the great house like someone who no longer knew the way home, guided only by instinct, and locked herself in her room, sitting on the 4-poster bed with her hands trembling in her lap. Reverend Thomas Miller had dined in that very parlor. He had blessed the plantation at harvest time. He had baptized the children of the enslaved with an air of magnanimity. He had smiled at Sarah with that stained-glass goodness she had never questioned, because she had never had reason enough. And he had condemned a 17-year-old girl to exile in a filthy hole, where she rotted for 8 years until she died alone, with only an 8-year-old child to hold her hand. Evil, Sarah realized in that dark room, does not wear the face of evil. It wears a collar. It wears a silver crucifix. It wears the voice that knows just the right tone to make others bow their heads and believe. Evil lives where no one thinks to look for it, because everyone is too busy looking down, at the slaves, at the poor, at the voiceless, convinced that danger always comes from below, never from above. That night, Sarah did not sleep. And something changed that day, in a way that was slow and irreversible, like a root beginning to crack a stone from the inside, invisible until the moment the stone splits in two. The following morning dawned heavy, the sky the color of lead, the air still and damp like a wet cloth. Sarah went down to the great house kitchen before anyone else, sat at the dark wood table, and waited. The wood stove was being lit by the house girls who arrived in silence, eyes low, the automatic movements of those who always do the same. The smell of strong coffee and baking biscuits filled the room, but Sarah felt none of it. There was a scene she couldn't get out of her head. Hattie kneeling on the floor of that shack, placing breadcrumbs on Bessie's cracked lips, with a tenderness that seemed impossible to come from such small hands and such a hard life. That child had learned love in a place where love was not cultivated. She had learned to care in a world that treated her as an object, and Sarah, who had received love and care all her life, had spent 20 years without knowing how to do either. She waited. Hattie appeared through the back door carrying an empty wicker basket, her eyes swollen and red, her clothes stained with damp earth. When her eyes met Sarah's, she froze mid-step. Fear flashed across the girl's face like a quick shadow, and she began to shake, the basket slipping from her hands and rolling across the floorboards. "With all respect, ma'am," Hattie said, her voice coming out thin and broken. "I can explain." Sarah took a deep breath. "Hattie, come here." The girl approached slowly, bare feet dragging on the floor, expecting the punishment she imagined was inevitable. Sarah reached out her hand and touched the child's face with a softness that surprised them both. Hattie shivered. She was not used to being touched with delicacy. "I know about the bread," Sarah said. "I know where you went. I know who you were with. I know who Bessie was." She paused. "And I know she was your mother." Hattie collapsed. She wept with that bottomless grief of one who has lost everything at once, clutching Sarah's robe with two small hands, as if it were the only solid thing left in existence. "She died. My mother died in my arms, and I couldn't do nothing." Sarah held the girl. She ran her hand through the child's thick, tangled hair and stayed that way, holding that small, desperate weight, feeling for the first time in 20 years what it meant to be truly present, not with words of command, not with cold orders, with presence, with humanity. When she finally released Hattie gently, she wiped the tears from the girl's face with the sleeve of her robe and said, "I will not punish you. I will not tell the colonel. But you must tell me where Bessie's body is now." "Ruth went with me at dawn," Hattie answered, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "We buried her under a black walnut tree near the shack. There was no coffin, no white shroud. We just dug a hole, and I prayed everything I knew." Sarah closed her eyes. She imagined the scene, an enslaved woman and an 8-year-old child in the dark of pre-dawn, burying a body in the ground without ceremony or witness, as if it were refuse. The injustice of it was so great it seemed to pull the air from the room. "And does Ruth know who your father is?" Sarah asked, her voice low. Hattie nodded. "She knows. She's the one who told me when I was little, said I could never speak it, that if anyone knew, the Reverend would have me killed." The name of Reverend Thomas Miller echoed in Sarah's mind like a cracked bell. She stood up and began to pace the kitchen, thoughts colliding. The house girls watched from a distance without approaching, and then Sarah stopped. She looked at Hattie with a resolve she didn't know she possessed. "Hattie, I'm going to confront Reverend Miller. I'm going to make him look at you and acknowledge you are his daughter." The girl's eyes went wide. "No, ma'am, he'll deny it. Then he'll have us dead." Sarah knelt in front of Hattie, holding the girl's thin shoulders firmly. "That man cannot go on living like a saint while he left your mother to die hidden in a hole. He must pay for what he did. And you deserve better than this life," Hattie cried. But there was a different light in her eyes now. It wasn't hope yet, but it was the shadow of it, the place where hope could be born if someone watered it. That same afternoon, Sarah sent a message to the parsonage in Savannah. She requested the Reverend's presence at Oakwood Grove for a private confession of extreme urgency. The Reverend could not refuse. It was custom for the ladies of the plantations to request private counsel. It was part of the sacred theatre that sustained that world. Reverend Thomas Miller arrived at dusk, riding his white mare, his black frock coat impeccable, the silver crucifix on his chest catching the last rays of sun. His round, rosy face radiated that practiced kindness so many mistook for virtue. Sarah received him in the parlor, ordered everyone out, even Colonel Silas, who protested but eventually obeyed his wife's unusual insistence. Only the two of them remained. And hidden behind a carved mahogany screen, invisible but present, was Hattie. Sarah had insisted the girl be there. There are truths that must be heard before they are believed. The Reverend sat in a stuffed armchair, crossed his hands over his rounded belly, and smiled with that stained-glass sympathy he used with all his flock. "My daughter, Sarah. What urgency is this that afflicts you?" Sarah remained standing, hands clasped behind her back, her body tense as a tightened fiddle string. She looked him directly in the eye. "Reverend Miller, I wish to speak of Bessie." The Reverend's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, so quick that any other would not have noticed. But Sarah noticed. "Bessie, I do not recall. There are so many servants in this county." "Bessie, the maid who disappeared from this plantation 8 years ago. That Bessie. I'm certain the Reverend remembers her very well." The Reverend shifted his posture. His eyes narrowed. "I do not know where you intend to go with such insinuations." "I intend to go to the truth," Sarah said, her voice cutting. "The truth about what you did to Bessie one night when she was only 17. The truth about the daughter born of that act. The truth about the 8 years she spent hidden in a shack, dying of hunger and rot, because you threatened her with death if she told." The Reverend's face went pale. He stood up from the chair. "This is a most grave accusation. You have no proof. You are slandering a man of God." Sarah took a step forward. She did not flinch. "Bessie is dead, Reverend. She died yesterday in that filthy hole. But before she died, she told everything to her daughter, to Hattie. Your daughter, Reverend Thomas Miller." The silence that followed was deafening. The Reverend opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, unable to form words. The silver crucifix on his chest seemed heavier than ever, as if it knew the lie it had protected for 8 years had just shattered into 1,000 pieces on the cold parlor floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and menacing, the mask of kindness completely discarded, leaving only the man who had always been behind it. "You are playing with fire, Mrs. Preston. A Reverend's word against the word of a dead slave and a child. You know how that ends." And then something happened that no one expected. Sarah slammed her fist onto the table with a force that made the Reverend recoil 2 steps. "You violated that woman. You are the father of that child. You condemned her to live in hiding, without dignity, without anything, for 8 years. You are a monster, Reverend Miller, a monster dressed as a saint." The Reverend tried to compose himself, smoothing his coat with hands that shook with a mixture of rage and fear. When he spoke, there was venom in his voice. "And what do you intend to do with this information? Denounce me to whom? To the bishop? To the colonel? A Reverend's word against a lady who has lost her wits. You know how that ends." Sarah wiped the tears with the back of her hand. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was firm as stone. "I will not denounce you, Reverend. I will do something far worse. I am taking Hattie away from here. I will give her a life of dignity, education, freedom, and when I die I will leave a written letter telling everything to be opened and read publicly. You may live your farce while I am alive, but after, the hell you preach so much will be waiting." The Reverend went livid. He stumbled toward the door, turned one last time, eyes burning with fury. "With all respect, Mrs. Preston, you will regret this." And he left, slamming the door with such force the sound echoed through the great house like a gunshot. As soon as he left, Hattie stepped out from behind the screen and ran to Sarah, hugging her with both arms. "Are you really going to take me away?" Sarah held the girl tight. She didn't know how. She didn't know how to face Colonel Silas, who would never let a valuable servant go without explanation. She didn't know how to resist the pressure of society, of the neighbors, of that entire structure built on the exploitation of those bodies and those lives. But she knew one thing. She had crossed a line, and on the other side of that line, there was no more pretending she didn't see. "Yes, Hattie, I will. I don't know how yet, but I will. I promise you." That night the rain fell over Oakwood Grove with the force of something dammed up for a long time. It washed the red earth, raised the smell of wet clay, filled the wooden barrels at the edges of the quarters. And Sarah, lying awake while the colonel snored beside her, listened to the rain and felt that something inside her had been washed too, not knowing yet what would come in its place. The following days were of waiting and silent agony. Sarah locked herself in her room after lunch, writing drafts of letters she later tore up, making plans that collapsed before they took shape. How could she take Hattie from the plantation? The girl was legally enslaved, property of Colonel Silas. To buy her would require money Sarah did not directly control. To free her would require her husband's consent, which he would never give. To run with her would require courage of a kind Sarah was still learning to have. Meanwhile, she saw Hattie every day passing through the kitchen, head low, eyes red but dry, carrying her small, silent grief like just another plantation burden. Every time their eyes met, there was an understanding between them that no words had created and no words could undo. Hattie knew Sarah had promised. Sarah knew Hattie was waiting, and that waiting had a physical weight, like the water before a storm. 10 days later, the answer came without her having to seek it. A messenger arrived at the grove in the middle of the afternoon, galloping desperately, his shirt soaked with sweat and his voice breaking even before he dismounted. "Colonel Silas, Colonel. It's Reverend Miller. He suffered an accident on the road back to Savannah, fell from his mare, hit his head on a rock. He's dying at the parsonage. They sent for the doctor from the city, but it looks like there's no hope. He's asking for all the important folk of the county. Says he wants to make a public confession before he goes." Sarah's heart dropped. Public confession. The Reverend was going to tell everything. He was going to expose Hattie, drag that girl's name through the mud, take his revenge on Sarah even at death's door. Panic seized her chest with the speed of one who never expected it, but always feared it. She held onto the wall to keep from stumbling, while Colonel Silas gave orders to ready the carriage. The trip to Savannah took 2 hours under the scorching sun, and the whole way Sarah kept her hands clenched in her lap, praying in silence without being able to remember the words of the prayers. The interior of the carriage smelled of hot leather and old wood, and the wheels jolting on the irregular stone path made everything shake. Colonel Silas spent most of the trip with arms crossed and a grim face, grumbling about mad preachers and unnecessary scandals. Sarah didn't answer. She looked out the window at the white cotton passing like an endless sea, and thought of Hattie. She thought of Bessie. She thought of what had happened and what was about to happen. When they arrived at the parsonage, a simple white-walled building next to the church, a crowd had already gathered. Planters, gentlemen, merchants, local authorities, all the men and women of power in the region, gathered in the same cramped space, whispering with that anxiety of those who feel something is about to crack the known world. The air inside the house smelled of beeswax, human sweat, and that heavy, sweet smell that sometimes precedes death, when the body begins to say goodbye to itself. Inside, lying on a narrow bed with white linen sheets already stained, was Reverend Thomas Miller. His face was the color of wax, a bloodied bandage wrapped around his head, eyes half closed. A white-bearded doctor stood by, shaking his head slowly. There was nothing left to do. The Reverend was dying. When his half-open eyes found Sarah entering the door, a crooked and sinister smile appeared on his cracked lips. She realized he knew she was there, and that he was going to make a point of destroying her. The Reverend raised a trembling hand and asked for silence. The crowd went still at once. Now every second in that room weighed a ton. The Reverend's voice came out weak, but still audible enough to reach every corner of the stifling room. "My brothers, my children in Christ, I do not have much time. Before I depart for the final judgment, I must cleanse my soul. I must confess a terrible sin I have carried for 8 years." Sarah felt her legs go weak. Colonel Silas beside her turned to her, confused. The crowd was absolutely motionless. No one even dared breathe deep. 8 years ago, I committed an act of violence against an innocent woman, an enslaved woman named Bessie from Oakwood Grove. One of the women present gasped, hand to her mouth. A man coughed. Silas's eyes went wide. "Bessie did not run. I forced her one night when she was only 17. She became with child. A girl was born of that violence. I threatened to kill any who spoke of it. And Bessie lived 8 years hidden in a filthy shack until she died of sickness alone, with no one but a child to hold her hand." The crowd exploded in murmurs. Horrified women, incredulous men, a reverend confessing violence, confessing a bastard child born of a slave. It was a rupture in the fabric of that world carefully maintained by appearance. Colonel Silas was red with fury. "Reverend, how dare you stain the name of my plantation with this talk? This child, where is this child? Reverend Miller ignored the colonel. With visible effort, he turned his face towards Sarah. Slowly, very slowly, his half-closed eyes found hers. The room seemed to have shrunk around that moment. Every person present stood still like figures in a painting. The white-bearded doctor with his hand frozen in mid-air, the colonel with clenched fists and a red face, the mourning women grouped by the window, fans motionless, the silver crucifix on the reverend's chest, rising and falling more slowly with each breath, and Sarah standing in the middle of the room, eyes fixed on the man she had confronted days ago, trying to understand what her eyes were seeing. There was no rage in that face. There was something she had never expected to find there. There was shame. And there was somehow relief. Like someone who has carried a weight for so long, they forgot what it was to walk without it, and who suddenly, at the last moment, decides to drop it all on the ground. Then he spoke, the words coming with a slowness that seemed to overcome every inch of resistance left in him. The girl's name is Hattie. She is guilty of nothing. She is innocent. But I have sinned against God and against humanity. A pause, breath rasping in his chest like coarse sand. And now I wish to try and mend what I broke. He made a slight gesture with his hand. A parish assistant stepped forward with a sealed envelope. In this envelope is a deed of manumission, written with my last strength. In it, I recognize Hattie as my daughter. As the daughter of a free man, even if a reverend, she cannot be bound. By the law of God and the law of man, I set her free. Hattie is free. The silence that followed was of a different kind. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of those trying to process something that changes the geometry of the world. Sarah couldn't believe it. She had prepared for the worst, and the Reverend had chosen something else. He had chosen, in the last possible hour, that which for 8 years he had refused to be. Then Reverend Thomas Miller turned his face one last time, looking directly at Sarah, with eyes that were already beginning to dim. And I leave Hattie under the guardianship of Mrs. Sarah Preston of Oakwood Grove. She is the only person who had the courage to confront me, the only one who defended Bessie and the child, the only one who made me see the monstrosity of what I did. A final breath. Take care of the girl. Give her the life I denied, and forgive if you can this old sinner. The Reverend's head slumped to the side. The doctor stepped close, 2 fingers on the neck. A pause. He is gone. In that room smelling of old incense and the sweat of frightened people, Reverend Thomas Miller had died. And with him, the secret he had tried to bury for 8 years had finally come to light, not as the shame of a child, but as the confession of a man who chose truth in the last breath available. The trip back to Oakwood Grove was made in heavy silence. Colonel Silas was humiliated and furious, but the manumission papers were legal, witnessed by the doctor and authorities. Hattie was free, and she was under Sarah's care. When the carriage stopped in the yard, it was already night. Sarah stepped down without waiting for help and went directly to the quarters, where Hattie slept beside Ruth on a pallet of straw. She knelt beside the girl and woke her gently, holding her small hand in the dark. Hattie, wake up, my child. The girl opened her eyes startled, expecting the worst, but then she saw the smile on Sarah's face, a smile wet with tears and full of something the 8-year-old didn't know how to name, but felt in her chest like warmth. Hattie, you are free. Reverend Miller freed you before he passed. You are no longer bound. Hattie sat paralyzed. Ruth beside her woke and began to cry without being able to stop, hugging the girl tight. Free, my girl. You're free. With all respect, Ma'am, Ruth said, looking at Sarah over Hattie's head, eyes full of water and something that would take years to find the right name for. You did what no other would have done. Sarah shook her head. I did what I should have done long ago. In the months that followed, things changed in ways the Grove had never seen. Sarah brought Hattie to live in the great house, not as a maid, but as a ward. The girl was given her own room, clean clothes, plenty of food. Sarah hired a teacher from Savannah, an elderly man with thick glasses and infinite patience, to teach Hattie to read and write. The girl learned with a speed that made the teacher scratch his head and hide a smile. There was a hunger for knowledge in Hattie's eyes that seemed to come from before she was born, as if all the words Bessie had never been able to read and all the books Ruth had never been able to touch were waiting to be absorbed by her, with interest. Colonel Silas protested with that voice of thunder that had ruled the grove for decades. A free-colored girl in the great house like she's kin. It's an absurdity. Sarah looked him in the eye for the first time in 20 years of marriage. She is a human being, Silas, and if you do not accept it, I will return to my father's house in Charleston and take Hattie with me, and I will tell all of society exactly why your wife left you. The colonel, too proud to face the scandal, gave in. Never with love, but with a grumbling tolerance that was the most he could offer. There were times the colonel passed the room where Hattie studied and stopped for a moment, observing that black child focused over a book with a furrowed brow, and there was something in that look hard to name. Perhaps the beginning of a doubt, perhaps the spark of a conscience that had never been lit before. Ruth was also freed. Sarah used part of her personal inheritance to buy Ruth's freedom from her husband. The two, adoptive mother and daughter, stayed together at the Grove, but now with dignity. Ruth began working as a salaried cook in the great house, and in the evenings after work, she sat beside Hattie and listened to the girl read aloud the books the teacher brought. The tears running down Ruth's aging face were of a different kind. They were of pride, of gratitude, of proof that love survives everything that tries to destroy it. Years passed. Hattie grew. By 15, she read French and English, knew mathematics, and knew the history the schools didn't teach. The history of those who had been bound, who had resisted, who had fought for freedom with the tools they had, which were sometimes the strength of their arms and sometimes the memory of their ancestors, and sometimes simply the stubbornness to keep existing. Hattie had inherited that stubbornness from Bessie, and she had inherited that love from Ruth that doesn't ask if it's deserved, it simply gives. She never forgot the mother who died in a filthy shack, nor the mother who raised her with love in the quarters, and she never forgot the lady who had risked everything to defend her, who had knelt on the dirt floor of the quarters without caring for her silk dress, who had looked at her and seen a person when the whole world only saw property. One Sunday afternoon, Hattie was sitting under the walnut tree where Bessie was buried, wildflowers laid on the earth, praying softly. The sweet, heavy smell of the walnuts mixed with the scent of damp earth and warm grass. Birds sang in the high canopy. The world for a moment seemed to suspend its cruelty and simply exist. Sarah approached in silence and sat beside her on the grass, not worrying about the silk of her skirts. The two stayed there looking at the horizon tinted orange and red. "Miss Sarah," Hattie said, her voice soft, "why did you do all this for me? You could have pretended you saw nothing." Sarah stayed quiet for a long moment. Then she answered with an honesty that only comes from one who has stopped lying to herself. "I could have. And for 20 years of my life, that is exactly what I did. I pretended not to see, pretended not to know, pretended everything was fine. But when I followed you that afternoon and found the truth, something broke inside me. I realized all the prayers I prayed and all the embroidery I made meant nothing if I stayed blind to the suffering around me. You saved me, Hattie. It was you who saved me." Hattie took Sarah's hand and squeezed it. "You saved me too, ma'am. You gave me something I never thought I'd have. Hope." The two stayed there until the sun vanished completely, replaced by the full moon that lit the grove with its silver light. And that night, under the tree that held Bessie's remains, two women separated by color, by origin, by everything that cruel society deemed important, were joined by something much stronger than all of that. Years later, when Sarah was on her deathbed, old and tired, it was Hattie who held her hand. The 25-year-old woman was a teacher at a school for free black children she herself had founded in Savannah, using part of the inheritance Sarah had left her. Colonel Silas had died before her, bitter and alone. But Sarah died in peace, surrounded by love. "Hattie," she whispered, her voice weak as a leaf in the wind. "Did I do enough?" Hattie wept, squeezing the wrinkled hand of the woman who had been mistress, guardian, and, in the end, mother. "You did more than enough. You changed the world, at least my world." Sarah smiled for the last time. She closed her eyes, and she passed. That night, Hattie returned to the walnut tree. She laid fresh flowers on 2 graves now, Bessie's and Sarah's. She prayed for the 2 angels who had marked her life, one who gave her body, the other who gave her a future. And she made a silent promise. Under the infinite stars of the Georgia sky, she would fight so that no other child would need to steal bread to feed a hidden mother, so that no other Bessie would die in a nameless hole, so that no other soul would live and die invisible, as if they had never existed. The fight was only beginning. But thanks to a stolen biscuit, to a lady who chose to see, and to a truth that insisted on surviving, there was now hope, where before there was only despair. Sometimes redemption is born in the most unlikely places, in the small and brave hands of a child who steals bread not for herself, but out of love. Bessie died in the shadows, but her daughter bloomed in the light. Sarah lived surrounded by luxury and was poor in humanity, until Hattie showed her where true wealth lives, not in mahogany furniture, nor in the silver the bound ones polished without ever being allowed to touch, but in the eyes of one seen for the first time as a person. This story reminds us that it is never too late to do what is right, that a single act of courage can break chains that seemed eternal, and that true freedom is not just in breaking iron shackles, but in freeing our hearts